Hello, my name is Trey Breshears, and this will be my final oral presentation for Engineering Management 5512. So I want to talk about one of the cases related to the Hyatt Regency walkway collapse. First thing I'll do is I'll give you a little bit of background on what happened there. So the Hyatt Regency walkway collapse took place in July of 1981 in Kansas City, Missouri. There were three walkways suspended in the atrium of a hotel, and they were having a Friday night tea social gathering. There were over 1,200 people in attendance there, and a bunch of people on the walkways, and the walkways collapsed on top of each other. 114 people were killed, over 200 more people were injured, and of course, with any big thing like that, there's going to be a whole slew of lawsuits that come following that. So, I mean, everything from the hotel owner suing the designers and the engineers and designers suing each other, people trying to sue for damages for lost loved ones or injuries or whatever. But the case that I really want to focus on in this presentation is Duncan versus the Missouri Board for Architects. So this case actually came after quite a lot of the other stuff had already gone down. So the Missouri Board for Architects, Professional Engineers, and Land Surveyors had found that the plaintiffs in this case, Daniel Duncan, Jack Gillum, and GCE International Incorporated as a company, were no longer allowed to practice engineering in the state of Missouri. They had their engineering certificates revoked. GCE was the structural engineer in charge of the project. They subcontracted Jack Gillum and company, and of that, Duncan was the employee that actually designed the part that failed. There were 180 findings of fact for this decision, and 5 of which were challenged. So this whole case, I mean, the fact that only 5 out of 180 were challenged is kind of our first pointer that this is really them just grasping at straws here. At no point did they try to admit that this wasn't their fault or that they didn't do what was supposed to be necessary for the engineering project. That ship had kind of sailed, but this was more about them trying to argue that they should still be allowed to practice engineering in the state of Missouri. Of the 5 facts that were challenged, 1 was a conclusion of law, so that was thrown out immediately. For 1, there was no specificity that was given. I'll talk about that one in a little bit. For 1, it was rejected as a matter of degree, and the other 2 were affirmed. But one of the interesting things I found about this case, and one of those 2 that were affirmed, was the idea of gross negligence. So both Duncan and Jack Gillum were found to be guilty of gross negligence. It kind of came down to the fact that they didn't review the drawings for the Hyatt Regency thing at all. A design change was made in the field, and it was sent back to Duncan to review. Duncan was basically just like, yeah, it's fine. Jack Gillum stamped it without looking at it, and of course that went through, and the tragedy happened because the engineers weren't doing their jobs. Gross negligence was one of the basis for the reasons that the board didn't want to allow those 3 entities to practice engineering anymore. So that became a kind of a main topic for this case. At one point, they were trying to claim that this was a violation of constitutional rights. They were basically saying that the term gross negligence is just so vague that it denies our due process. But if you kind of look at it, there's another court case that was also referenced in this case from City of St. Louis versus Butler, and it basically just says you can't wait until after you've lost and then try to drag in a constitutional issue at the very end as a last-ditch effort. This whole court case is a last-ditch effort, but that just got pretty much thrown out. If you do have a constitutional issue, that should be set up front, as soon as you realize it. That should be a really big point of and an issue that's going on. But because it wasn't, it just wasn't even considered at all. And then also, gross negligence differs from regular negligence, not just in the degree of negligence or in the the type of negligence that's going on, but more in that it's its own thing. It's so far outside of what's ordinary. You so badly just weren't paying attention or didn't do your job that it's what they said was an extreme departure from the norm. And that's what happened here. They just straight up weren't doing their jobs. All right, and then in terms of for the finding, basically the justification for why the punishment that was decided on was okay was that it's not intended to punish the people whose certificates are being revoked. It's intended to protect the public. If you're going to do this, they don't want these 3 entities to have even the chance to do this again. This is such a terrible tragedy. It's still the one of the top worst engineering tragedies ever. because Jack Gillum didn't accept responsibility for his stamp. So I mean, Duncan designed the part, designed the drawing, and then Gillum actually stamped it, put his seal on it. And in the case, he testified that, well, I stamped it, but because I wasn't directly overseeing Duncan, it's not really my fault. That was still defined as like a blatant act of gross negligence. Like, that's, as an engineer, like, that's your job. You put your stamp on something, you are affirming and verifying that it is good to go. And obviously, in this case, it was not. The only one thing that was reversed from this was misconduct against Jack Gillum for the actual process of the design review. He did the design review, the active design review, not in his own terms. Like, he should have looked at the drawings, but he didn't. But the design review in like the group setting was done according to how it should have been. There was no specific evidence. This was one of the points that was I talked about earlier. There was no specific evidence from the board that said that Gillum was not doing what he was supposed to in the actual design review, like group design review. So that was reversed, but all other aspects of the discipline were affirmed and said that it was good to go. So that is the case. I had a lot of fun reading this. It was really interesting to see kind of the legal side of this. I know we talked about it a lot in ethics, but actually figuring out like why some of this went down and what happened to them from the legal standpoint afterward was very interesting to learn. So this has been my presentation. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.